Ladies and gentlemen, I do not wish to indulge in regional stereotypes, but we normally begin all Middle East presentations 15 minutes late. I think in this case, we will make an exception. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Gary Langer. A lot of you have heard him present before. You've seen the work that he's done on ABC, the Washington Post, and a host of other sources. But anecdotally, I think it's interesting that originally Gary was going to come down and present only in Afghanistan in the winter. And unfortunately, the weather intervened. And between that time and today, we have gone from a focus on Afghanistan to a world in which we have a continuing arc of instability from Pakistan to Morocco, and where time and again we are discovering that it is people's opinions and views that really do count. And it is understanding what motivates and drives them that is something that is critical and can only be determined by what they feel rather than some set of outside metrics. And Gary's going to give us two very interesting contrasting case studies today. One is Afghanistan and the other is Yemen, and exactly how he's going to balance it is a mystery I'll leave to him. So let me introduce Gary and let him take over.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks to Tony. Thank you all for coming very much. The way I'm going to balance the presentation is with a lot of slides. I told Tony that my presentation today was based on the principles of shock and awe. He told me that shock is easy. We'll have to see about the awe. Originally, as Tony mentions, we were going to talk just about Afghanistan, our latest survey there, which is the latest in a 6-year series of annual surveys we've done in Afghanistan, starting with the first news-sponsored public opinion survey done in that country back in 2005, and then continuing every year since. I've done those with the sponsors of ABC News and various other partners, the BBC, German television network ARD, the Washington Post, and our most recent venture. And their support for this effort has been critical. An ice storm delayed that presentation and enabled me to bring in data which I'm going to present first from another survey we've done, this for the Broadcasting Board of Governors in Yemen. And it's, I think, important for me to express their gratitude for being able to share this presentation with you. A few first points. These data, I believe, are essential in helping us understand the underlying attitudes in these populations. But while data are compelling, they also need to be approached with caution and with a broader understanding of how they were obtained. We live in a world of data, some of it very high quality, some of it in the middle, and some far less so. And I think it's essential in assessing any data before we get seduced by the numbers to evaluate the methodology that went into collection of these data and understand if it met the basic principles of probability sampling, of inferential statistics that's required for us to draw conclusions about our results. The next step then is not to get seduced by any individual number and a percentage sign, while compelling is in itself a commodity. We need to draw meaning from these while staying within the bounds of the principles of inferential statistics and in only analyzing and making conclusions that are supported by statistical significance, but also in understanding that we're trying to pull various bits and pieces of data together, evaluating what we asked, what responses we received to tell a story and reach a broader conclusion about the population. Our survey I'm going to talk first about is in Yemen. This survey was conducted in December 2010. I regard it as a baseline survey. I haven't surveyed in Yemen before. It's valuable, essential indeed, to have trend over time to understand the movement of public attitudes and what they mean. We don't have that in this survey. This is our first. Also, it's a survey that was done in December. I'm not going to tell you that this predicted the current events that we're seeing in this country and the tumult that's occurring there and across the Arab world. What it does give us is a basic understanding of the underlying public attitudes in this country is measured at the time. And that helps us inform, I think, our understanding of how to understand and approach this population as we go forward. You can see there the basics of it. It is a national and area probability sample. We're fortunate in a country like Yemen specifically to have a reasonably recent national census publicly released. I think it was conducted in 2004. Really essential and useful in our area probability sampling. We had full national coverage and good rigorous methodology in the survey. Fieldwork was carried out by D3 Systems, a firm I work with in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now in Yemen. In this case, they went in and trained up and worked with the Yemen Polling Center to get the fieldwork done. What I'm going to talk to you about in our Yemen data are Yemenis' evaluations of national institutions, local conditions, their preferences for governance, relevant characteristics and interests and information levels in this population. We've built some indices of disaffection and of engagement that I think will be interesting in understanding some of the divisions within the population. What we're aiming at here in this project is an understanding of the key elements of public sentiment in Yemen, which is essential, I think, for engagement and communication with the population going forward. Here are a few basics if we just want to look at the population. Some drawn from our data. A lot of poverty, not a lot of education. High levels of unemployment or reported self-employment, and significant development challenges, as you can see. Much of the population is in North Yemen, which is worth knowing and I think important to know given the sharp attitudinal differences we see in a variety of measures, as anyone who knows the history of the country would expect between the North and South. Now, attitudinally, let's start with some ratings among Yemenis of the basic government institutions, confidence in those. The first big picture to see is that there's a marked absence of support in these data or of confidence in government institutions. Positive ratings, excellent or good for the performance of the central government, the police, the army, the local army, and the district government are all below 40%. At the same time, I think the next point, and I think this will help us peel back the layers of these data, as is also necessary in any data, is to understand that the absence of support, while important, is not necessarily analogous to the presence of discontent. In fact, very large numbers told us they had no opinion of these institutions, as you can see. Still, nonetheless, if you just look at the positive and negative ratings, the first two bars for each category, there's not a whole lot of support for any of these institutions other than the Army, which, where it has local operations, is viewed positively by 2 to 1. Particularly not of the district government, a potentially troubling result because that's the level of government closest to the people, and that's the one most negatively rated. So we drill in a little further and look at these data by sex. And what we see here is an enormous number of women in Yemen expressing no opinion about these institutions compared to the attitudes of men. There's really sort of two possible explanations here. This could reflect a socio-cultural phenomenon in which women are culturized not to hold opinions, which I tend to doubt, or more likely not to express them. It is in any case important to know if you're going to be looking at data from this country or perhaps similar countries. And if you want to understand these populations, and particularly if you want to think about a strategy for communicating with them, this lack of engagement, or certainly at this stage, a lack of willingness to express sentiment among women is quite notable, as you can see in the data. Among those, now we percentage out those no opinions, among those who do express an opinion of these institutions, we see that men rate them more negatively than do women, substantially in some cases. At the same time, we ask people to rate the performance or their view of the country's president, and we see an 80% favorable rating. it's almost implausible to accept that a single leader can have 40 to 50 points higher favorability than the institutions of the very government that he leads, unless we understand, as best we can, the nature of this sort of society. And we've seen these sort of data to some extent in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in other countries that have tribal societies in which a paramount leader, often by acquiescence, earns expressed support. Now, it could be a coerced expression of support, except that in a country like Afghanistan, we've seen a very similar phenomenon. And it's really not coerced, I don't believe, in this extent in Afghanistan. So I would take the salad favorability ratings, not with a grain of salt. It means not that it wasn't expressed, it was. But we have to put in place our understanding of the cultural norms in the society and the attraction and expressed support for a paramount leader that we see in these data. More important, I think, is when we look behind these numbers at the ratings of the very institutions of government that he leads, and we see them far softer and far weaker. I mentioned earlier some of the dramatic differences we see, particularly by region. Look at the favorability of the president. Perhaps this won't be a surprise for those of you who know Yemen. In the north of the country, the very more popular north, as compared to the south. Other ratings, I think, have shed important light. On the left, asking Yemenis their expectations of life a year from now. On the positive side, one is not so bad. We find a substantial plurality, 48% of Yemenis expressing optimism for the future, that their lives a year from now will be better. Or just 19% expect their lives to be worse. On the other hand, it's probably worth keeping in mind that this is hardly a rousing endorsement, in that about half the country expects no improvement in their own lives in the next year, and this in the Arab world's poorest nation. Also, while the personal measure of expected improvement got 48%, a lot fewer said the nation more broadly was headed in the right direction. As many said the country was going in the wrong direction. That 39%, by the way, right direction, coincides quite nicely with the first data I showed you about ratings of government overall, all in the mid to high 30s in terms of their favorability. So you have much more of a division when we ask Yemenis to think about the country's direction rather than their own prospects, personal prospects for betterment. There are negative groups, and this is pessimism, which is different from disengagement with government, what I'm going to talk about. This is more about personal optimism or pessimism. Men are much more negative, much more apt to say the country is going in the wrong direction. And somewhat more apt to say that their own life they expect to be worse. Older Yemenis are more negative. There's a lot of talk about engagement among young Yemenis and about the movement we're seeing now. But in terms of personal expectations, there's greater optimism, in fact, in the young, which of course can be a motivator. And dramatic differences, again, in the South, where they're by 25-point margin, citizens are more likely to think the country's going off in the wrong direction. Another measure, and I think this is a particularly valuable one when we're talking about engagement with government and removing it from the personal, perhaps, appeal or automatic support for a paramount leader, and asking Yemenis simply, if you had a complaint about a government official, do you think reporting it would make matters better, worse, or the same? A mere 14% in the population thinks that making a complaint about a government official would improve the situation, improve the condition. That's a kind of a fundamental disconnect with the operation of government, and I think an important one to be aware of. In some ways, a damning commentary that two-thirds, or nearly two-thirds, say this would have no effect, or indeed would make things worse. I mean, government is supposed to improve people's lives. This one seems to fail a basic test of confidence. And in doing so may shine a light, I would suggest, on the unrest we see today. When we ask about local conditions, towering majority rate there economic opportunities negatively. We don't have a measure of trajectory, whether these have gotten worse or gotten better over time, and that can be an essential element as well. This being our first in Yemen, I can't give you the trend, but certainly there are some troubling results here, particularly in the first three items: economic opportunities, infrastructure, and the availability of decent medical care, all overwhelmingly rated negatively by the citizens of Yemen. I mean, fundamentals of daily life. Availability of food is much less so, although, of course, food prices have been a challenge in that country. Security, least so. But even clean water, a 50-50 rating on the availability of clean water, as you can imagine, is hardly encouraging. We asked, now moving on to governance, where do we turn, if you will? Yemenis are interested in democracy, but in a qualified sense, I think, on two fronts. One, when we ask their preference for form of government, as you can see in this slide, democracy, Islamic State, or a single strong leader for life. More pick democracy than any other, indeed more than twice as many, which may be encouraging, I think, from a Western perspective. Just 16% picked a strong leader. Again, take note, President Saleh. On the other hand, you know, if 54% prefer democracy, that means 46% don't, so this is hardly Kansas. And really can't be approached as if it were. The next, I think, qualifier on this result on democracy is, actually there's a couple. One is it's higher among men than women, but that's again because women are less apt to express an opinion. All right? There's really not much difference between older and younger men. A little bit of a difference in North and South. And support for democracy is more of an urban phenomenon. But I'm sorry, but the qualifier I wanted to mention is that we separately ask, regardless of its form, strong leader, Islamic State, or democracy, do you prefer that the government of Yemen follow strict Islamic principles? And 83% of respondents say that it should, with about an even division of those who want it to be very strict or somewhat so. So it's a democracy for that 54%, but for the overwhelming majority across the board, it's a system that is informed and directed by strict adherence to Islamic principles. Differences here among groups, and this gets interesting, I think. Preference for strict adherence to Islamic principles by the government spikes or peaks among young men. It's present across groups, but lower among women, and even lower to some extent among older men than it is among young men. You know, young men are a group of interest, I think, are probably more likely to show up in city squares protesting. They may be different in some attitudes, not in a lot of the variables I've shown you so far. This is the first one in which we do see a significant difference between young men and the rest of the population. What we have here is sort of a higher expression of religious fundamentalism among young men. And a question that follows is that reflected in practice? And what's interesting is that it's not. In fact, young men are very substantially less likely than older men to report that they follow practice of prayer on the five times a day cycle, that they attend mosque regularly, or that even to a lesser extent of difference, but that they define themselves as strong believers. So now we have young men as a population that is more likely to express desire for a government that strictly follows Islamic principles, yet at the same time is less likely to personally practice some of the fundamentals of religious participation. This, to me, by the way, this is something we see across cultures, at least in terms of religious practice, is that religious even in the United States and elsewhere, religious practice, it tends to be a thing of age. And as people grow older, they become increasingly likely to engage in religious participation. But this difference between the expressed preference for a strict Islamic government and personal practice leads me to conclude that this is the preference we hear about governance. It reflects more how what these young Yemeni men have heard than about how they live, if you will, which suggests an impressionable population, and further data do to some extent support that conclusion. Young men compared to older men are a bit more likely to say they're influenced by their friends and associates, to say they're influenced by domestic and even by international media. Now, this suggests to us that there is the possibility, if you will, of communication with this population. It's a population that expresses somewhat more openness to influence in terms of communication by associates and media alike. But there's a challenge. We need to know more about the approach. And what we find is that the interest and information levels in these populations, and this is across the population because we didn't see a lot of difference among groups, is quite low. Right? Outside of local and religious events. So in the number of Yemenis who say they're informed about religious matters or interested in them, or local events, quite high. National events, dramatic fall off. And then when you get to world events, US policies, Western culture, we see very little self-expressed information levels and very little interest. It makes it a challenging population to reach out to when you look at the distribution across these areas. Now, there are differences, to some extent, if we break it by age and sex, looking at older versus younger men. And again, we see in this case less interest, less engagement among younger men. So it's a population that may be more impressionable, but at the same time it's going to be harder to get a hold of, harder to reach, harder to get their attention, given the self-expressed information and interest in the population. When we ask Yemenis what does influence their opinions, breaking it into this metric of very much and somewhat, the strongest lever, if you will, is household members, immediate associates, then religious leaders, the friends is there, and then a dramatic fall off in terms of the attitude movers in the population, community, elders, Yemeni news, political leaders, and international news. It's a very community-based population with very much of a one-on-one focus in terms of information sources and influences. So we used these data that I presented you to build two indices. One is an index of disaffection, of discontent or of lack of confidence in the government, using some of the variables I showed you. The Cronbach's alpha is high. There's a strong measure of continuity within these data. They work in the same direction. You can see the ratings that we used, and this describes some of the construct. Disaffection index, and then separately an engagement index to try to separate out the population groups that are most highly involved or interested in the changes and happenings in their society. In terms of disaffection, we see that it's, although the bars are slightly different, the two blue bars on the left, there's really no significant difference in our data in the level of disaffection with government between older and younger men. Men, though, are more disaffected with their government than are women. And the no opinions are out of this, by the way. Engagement, we find that young men, again, are less engaged, interested in local, national, and international events. Older men more so, and women much, much less so. that making them, of course, the hardest possible population to reach. That would require some real thinking about a strategy to communicate with Yemeni women. We look at our data by region. The disaffection, and I showed you some of that earlier, in the south is off the charts compared to what we see in the north. Engagement, however, is not significantly different in these two regions. And lastly, I think, as we look at it by urban and rural, there's no difference in urban and rural disaffection. This is an alienation from government. There's higher engagement in the urban areas. So two takeaways there. One is, if anyone wants to suggest that this is the phenomenon we've been seeing in the country is the manufactured by urban rabble-rousers, the data don't seem to support that. There's the equal levels of disaffection across the country between urban and rural levels. And there is a greater opportunity to communicate or engage with the urban population in terms of those possibilities. We take these data another way and break it into size groups. The low, moderate, and high disaffection. I think the takeaway here is if you look at in the high disaffection, there's a very substantial number of men. 3 in 10 is a large population group to be highly disaffected with the operation of government, far more so than women. And on the engagement index, you look at the low engagement, and again, you see a substantial number of men who are going to be hard to reach, low engagement, but an overwhelming number of women in these data. So our takeaways from Yemen are these. We see significant levels of disaffection, of skepticism of government in this December survey, broad and deep economic discontent in the development needs I showed you. A majority support for democracy, higher among men, but democracy guided by strict Islamic principles. We see an inward-looking society with low information or interest beyond the local, and broad and deep suspicions of the United States. I don't think I gave you those data, but the favorability of the United States is dreadfully low, single digit. And as I did show you, family, friends, and associates, religious leaders are the prime levers of influence. Any approach to this population, therefore, would really need to be Yemen-centric, because that's where the population is. All right, that summarizes what we have from Yemen. I think rather than take your questions about Yemen now, I'm going to move on to our Afghanistan stuff, changing gears. Take you through this, and then we'll reserve time for questions about either of these data sets at the end.